For 33 years, I believed I was the unwanted burden of two cold strangers who constantly reminded me of the debt I owed them for my existence. I thought I was unlovable until a car accident exposed a terrifying truth buried for 3 decades. I was not abandoned. I was the stolen heir to an empire, and the people I called parents were actually the kidnappers who had snatched me from my cradle to squeeze me dry. My name is Elena. For 33 years, I have existed as a shadow within the sterile glass walls of Omni Global, analyzing data streams that make sense while my own life remained a chaotic equation I could never solve. I kept my head down and my circle small, a habit drilled into me by the two people who claimed to be my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Vance were not warm people. They were cold, calculating architects of my misery who viewed my existence as a debt that could never be fully repaid. Our relationship was a transactional nightmare. Every phone call from them was a demand, not a check-in. They constantly reminded me that they had picked me up when no one else wanted me, implying that I was a stray dog they had graciously decided not to drown. They manipulated me into believing I owed them my salary, my time, and my sanity, because they had put food on the table, even if that food was served with a side of bitter resentment. I believed them because I had no one else. I let them bleed my bank account dry because I thought that was the price of having a family. Then came the rain-slicked highway and the screech of tires that tore my reality apart. I woke up in a hospital bed, my body broken and my mind foggy from anesthesia. The accident had been severe. I had lost a significant amount of blood, and my internal injuries required complex surgery. The doctors needed a direct blood donation or a tissue compatibility test for potential grafts. It should have been a simple request for my parents, who were standing nervously by the door. Their reaction was not one of concern. It was sheer, unadulterated panic. When the doctor asked Mrs. Vance to screen for a donation, she recoiled as if he had brandished a weapon. She started stammering about obscure religious objections that we had never practiced a day in our lives. Mr. Vance looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the exit. They did not ask if I would survive. They did not hold my hand. They simply refused to provide a single drop of blood and fled the hospital, claiming they could not bear to see me in such a state. That was when Dr. Sarah Miller, a close friend from college and the attending physician, walked in and locked the door behind her. Her face was pale. She held a clipboard against her chest as if shielding herself from the blow she was about to deliver. She told me that during the standard pre-op screening, they had run a full panel. She showed me the numbers. My blood type and specific genetic markers made it biologically impossible for Mr. or Mrs. Vance to be my parents. There was not even a remote chance of a distant relation. I spent the next 2 weeks recovering in silence, staring at the ceiling while the pieces of my childhood rearranged themselves into a terrifying mosaic. I realized there were no photographs of me as a newborn. I remembered how we moved to a different rental house every 8 months, always in the dead of night. I recalled the way Mr. Vance would tense up and pull me into the shadows whenever a police cruiser drove slowly down our street. The moment I was discharged, I did not go to my apartment. I drove to the Vance's dilapidated house while I knew they were at bingo. My hands shook as I picked the lock, a skill I had learned out of necessity years ago. The house smelled of stale smoke and secrets. I went straight to the loose floorboard under their bed, a hiding spot I had noticed as a child but was too afraid to touch. I pried the wood open and found a rusted metal box. I hoped for adoption papers or perhaps a letter explaining why my real parents had given me up. Instead, I found a fake birth certificate. It was a clumsy forgery, listing my place of birth as a hospital that had been demolished 5 years before the date listed. Beneath that lay the true horror. There were no baby booties or locks of hair. The box was filled with yellowed newspaper clippings carefully cut out and preserved. The headline on top screamed a tragedy from 33 years ago. It detailed the sensational kidnapping of the sterling heiress, a baby girl named Aurora who had vanished without a trace. I stared at the grainy photo of the missing infant, and then at the composite sketch of what she might look like as a toddler. The eyes staring back at me were my own. I treated the revelation in the box not as a memory, but as a data set that needed verification. I returned to my office at Omni Global in the dead of night, using my high-level security clearance to access archived media servers that were scrubbed from the public internet. I typed the name Sterling into the search bar, specifically filtering for the Texas oil dynasty and the kidnapping case that had dominated headlines 3 decades ago. The screen filled with high-resolution scans of old police files and newspaper clippings. I pulled up the age progression software we used for predictive analytics and fed it the only baby picture of Aurora Sterling available. The algorithm processed the facial structure, accounting for 33 years of aging. When the result rendered, I felt the air leave my lungs. The woman on the screen was me. The software highlighted the distinctive shape of the eyes and, more damningly, a small strawberry-shaped birthmark at the base of the hairline on the back of the neck. I reached back and touched the exact spot on my own skin, feeling the raised tissue that I had always assumed was just a random blemish. My phone vibrated against the mahogany desk, shattering the silence. "It was the Vances," I answered, and for the first time in my life, their voices were dripping with a sickening, synthetic sweetness. "Mr. Vance called me his beloved daughter, a term he had never used before. He told me they had found a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity that could secure our family's future forever. They needed cash, and they needed it immediately. He asked me to liquidate my retirement accounts and my emergency savings, promising that they would pay me back triple the amount within a month. My analyst brain connected the dots instantly. They were not investing. They were liquidating. They were terrified because they knew the police or someone else was sniffing around the accident report, or perhaps they had seen me enter their house earlier. I want to help," I lied, my voice steady despite the rage boiling in my veins. "But the bank needs 48 hours to process a withdrawal of that size. I need you to approve the transfer request I am sending to your phone to speed it up." I sent a link to Mr. Vance's smartphone. It was not a banking authorization, but a piece of military-grade spyware I had developed for corporate espionage monitoring. As soon as he clicked it, his microphone became my ears. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and listened to the live feed. The sweetness was gone, replaced by the frantic snarling of cornered rats. "We cannot wait 48 hours. You idiot!" Mrs. Vance hissed through the static. "If the cops check the blood type records from the hospital, we are done. We need that money to cross the border into Mexico by Friday." "She was a bad investment from the start," Mr. Vance grumbled, the sound of a zipper implying he was packing a bag. "We should have left her in a dumpster when the heat got too high. We were just the gardener and the maid. For God's sake, we could not fight the Sterling security team. Keeping her was the only way to ensure they did not kill us if we got caught." The confession was recorded and backed up to 3 separate cloud servers. They had admitted to everything. They were former servants who had stolen a child for a ransom they were too cowardly to collect, and then punished that child for 33 years for their own failure. I needed one final nail in the coffin. I could not rely solely on a recording that a lawyer might argue was taken illegally. I contacted a private investigator known for his discretion and high fees. I gave him one task: obtain a DNA sample from Mrs. Victoria Sterling, the matriarch of the oil empire. He tracked her to a charity gala in Dallas the following evening. Posing as a waiter, he managed to retrieve a ceramic coffee cup she had used and discarded. He rushed it to a private genetic testing lab where I had paid triple for an expedited rush order. 24 hours later, the email hit my inbox. I opened the PDF file, my hand trembling over the mouse. The probability of maternity was 99.99%. The science confirmed what my heart already knew. I was not the unwanted daughter of poor grifters. I was Aurora Sterling, the lost princess of an American dynasty, and I was finally awake. The realization that my entire life had been a fabrication did not break me. Instead, it calcified my heart into something cold and sharp. For 33 years, I had carried the heavy cloak of shame, believing I was defective, a burden that Mr. and Mrs. Vance had graciously agreed to carry. I had spent nights crying into my pillow, wondering why I was so unlovable. Now I knew the truth. The defect was not in my blood. It was in the souls of the monsters who had stolen me from a cradle lined with silk and forced me to sleep on a mattress of lies. I was not abandoned. I was hidden. I spent the next few days existing in a fugue state, watching the Sterling family from the digital shadows. I read articles about Victoria Sterling, my biological mother, a woman described as a living ghost who still kept a nursery preserved in amber for a daughter who never came home. I watched interviews with Julian Sterling, the brother I never knew I had. He was a titan of industry, carrying the weight of the Sterling Empire on his shoulders, yet every profile mentioned his tireless, quiet funding of missing children organizations. He was looking for me. They were all waiting for me. The urge to run to them, to crash through the gates of their estate and scream that I had returned, was overwhelming, but I swallowed it down. If I went back now, the Vances might slip away. They might plead ignorance or disappear into the chaotic underbelly of the world before justice could truly claim them. Prison was too good for them. I needed to dismantle them. I needed to give them hope. The kind of dazzling, blinding hope they had denied me, and then I needed to snuff it out. I initiated the game of cat and mouse with a phone call. My voice trembled, not with fear, but with the effort of suppressing my rage. I told Mr. Vance that I had done it. I told him I had liquidated my entire 401k and secured a high-interest loan from a private lender. I told him I had $500,000 in cash ready for their investment. They did not wait for an invitation. When I arrived at my apartment an hour later, the door was unlocked. The scene inside was a testament to their desperation and their cruelty. They had not just searched for the money, they had punished my space for not yielding it immediately. My bookshelves were overturned. The cushions of my sofa were slashed open, stuffing bleeding out onto the floor like white guts. My laptop was smashed. Mr. Vance was pacing the small living room, sweating profusely, while Mrs. Vance was throwing the contents of my jewelry box onto the floor, looking for anything pawnable. When she saw me, her eyes didn't hold an ounce of guilt. "Where is it?" she shrieked, lunging at me. "Where is the money, you ungrateful brat?" I shrank back, letting my shoulders slump, playing the role of the terrified daughter one last time. "I tried," I stammered, holding up my hands in surrender. "I have the approval, but the bank froze the transfer because of the amount. It triggered a fraud alert. I need a guarantor with high social standing to sign off on it to release the funds." Mr. Vance kicked a pile of books, cursing violently. "We don't have time for this. We need to leave tonight." "I have a solution," I said quickly, my voice dropping to a whisper. "My boss, the head of the new estate acquisition project. He is looking for staff. He needs a gardener and a head housekeeper for his new property immediately. He is desperate, and he is paying triple the market rate." I saw the gear shift in their eyes. The greed overtook the panic. They had been domestics 30 years ago. They knew the game. "Who is this boss?" Mr. Vance asked, narrowing his eyes. "Julian Sterling." I lied, dropping the name of my brother like a piece of raw meat into a shark tank. "He just bought a massive estate nearby. He needs staff who can start this weekend. If you impress him, not only will the salary cover your travel, but his signature on my guarantor form will release the $500,000 instantly." I watched them exchange a look. It was a mixture of arrogance and hunger. They remembered the Sterling name. They remembered the wealth. But their narcissism blinded them to the danger. They thought they were the smartest people in the room, the master manipulators who had gotten away with the crime of the century. They believed they could walk right back into the lion's den and steal another piece of meat without getting bitten. "Fine," Mrs. Vance sneered, smoothing down her disheveled blouse. "Set up the meeting. But if you are lying to us, Elena, I will leave you with nothing but the clothes on your back." "I promise," I said, looking down to hide the cold fire in my eyes. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime." And it was, just not for them. I had arranged the stage with the precision of a director setting up a tragedy. The interview took place in a rented executive suite in downtown Dallas, a space of chrome and glass that smelled of old money and aggressive leverage. I played the role of the dutiful assistant, guiding Mr. and Mrs. Vance through the mahogany doors. They had dressed in their Sunday best, but against the backdrop of genuine wealth, they looked like costumes that didn't quite fit. Mrs. Vance could not keep her hands to herself. I watched her run a finger over a baccarat crystal vase, her eyes calculating its pawn value rather than appreciating its artistry. Mr. Vance tugged at his collar, his gaze darting around the room with the feral alertness of a man who was used to looking for exits. When Julian Sterling entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop. He was taller than he appeared on television, carrying himself with a weary elegance that spoke of heavy burdens borne in silence. I stood in the corner, clutching a tablet to my chest to hide the violent pounding of my heart. This was my brother. This was the blood I shared. And here he was, shaking the hand of the man who had stolen me. Julian did not recognize them. 33 years is a lifetime, and the Vances had changed their names and weathered the erosion of time and poverty. He saw only the resume I had anonymously sent to his private email days before, claiming to be from a pair of veteran housekeepers who had served the family decades ago and wished to return to service. The interview began, and the Vances slipped into their old personas with terrifying ease. They were obsequious, their voices dropping an octave to sound servile and refined. They spoke of loyalty and discretion, words that tasted like ash in my mouth. However, in their eagerness to secure the job and the proximity to the Sterling fortune, they became careless. "We understand the delicate nature of antique maintenance," Mrs. Vance said, leaning forward. "Specifically how to polish the silver without damaging the family crest. We know Mrs. Sterling always hated the smell of lemon polish and preferred the unscented paste." Julian paused, his pen hovering over his notepad. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. That was a detail so specific, so intimate, that it should not have been known by random applicants. The Vances, sensing they had scored a point, smiled smugly. I saw my opening. I pulled my phone from my pocket and typed a message to the private number I had acquired from the company directory. I kept my face impassive as I hit send. Ask the gardener about the jagged scar on the palm of his left hand. He got it from the rosebushes in 1990. Julian's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, and his eyes widened imperceptibly. He looked up, his gaze shifting from the screen to Mr. Vance. The air in the room grew thick, charged with a sudden electric tension. "That is impressive experience," Julian said, his voice deadly calm. "Mr. Vance, would you mind pouring me a glass of water? The pitcher is to your left." Mr. Vance, eager to please, reached out with his left hand to grab the heavy crystal pitcher. As his fingers curled around the handle, the sleeve of his jacket pulled back, revealing the old, white, jagged line running across his palm. Julian stared at the scar. I saw his jaw tighten, the muscles in his neck cording as he processed the impossible reality. He was looking at the ghost of a memory, a physical marker that linked this stranger to the darkest year of his life. For a second, I thought he would lunge across the table, I thought he would break character and demand answers. But Julian Sterling was a CEO, a man trained to close deals and crush competitors. He blinked once, clearing the emotion from his face, and replaced it with a cold, shark-like smile. "You are exactly what we have been looking for," Julian said, though his eyes remained frozen. "I need you to start immediately. We are reopening the main estate this weekend for the anniversary. I want you both there on Friday morning." Mr. and Mrs. Vance beamed, exchanging a look of triumph. They thought they had just conned a billionaire. They had no idea they had just agreed to walk back into the scene of their crime, and this time the doors would lock behind them. I waited for Julian in the shadows of the underground parking structure beneath the building where the interview had taken place. When he approached his car, I stepped out, not as a sister, but as a stranger with a warning. I introduced myself as a private investigator, building a case against the Vances for extensive financial fraud, telling him that my investigation suggested they possessed critical information regarding the disappearance of Aurora Sterling. I could see the conflict warring behind his eyes. He was a man of logic, a man who ran a global empire, and yet the mention of his lost sister reduced him to a desperate brother willing to grasp at smoke. He asked me why I cared, and I lied, telling him it was just a job. He agreed to my terms. We would not arrest them immediately. We would let them enter the house, get comfortable, and incriminate themselves beyond any shadow of a doubt. The plan was a delicate game of chess. We needed the Vances to believe they had successfully infiltrated the pot of gold, so they would drop their guard. They made that easy for us. An hour after leaving the interview, Mr. Vance called me. His voice was thick with arrogance. He bragged about how easily he had charmed the young, naive CEO, claiming that his charisma alone had secured the position. Then came the demand. He told me that to truly cement their position in the household, they needed to show they were people of means, not just servants. He demanded I bring the $500,000 immediately so they could invest it in a scheme to gain Julian's financial trust, promising me a cut of the profits later. I feigned terror. I stuttered and cried, telling him that transferring the money electronically had been flagged, but I had managed to withdraw the cash. I promised to bring the $500,000 in a briefcase to the Sterling estate on Saturday night. Under the cover of the chaos of the company's anniversary gala, they took the bait instantly, their greed blinding them to the absurdity of the situation. However, their ambition was darker than I had anticipated. Through the spyware on Mr. Vance's phone, I listened to them plotting later that night. They had no intention of working. They were laughing about how much the estate had not changed in 33 years. They remembered the location of a wall safe in the library behind a false panel, a detail only the original staff would know. Their plan was to slip a sedative into the family's evening tea or champagne, wait for them to pass out, and then empty the safe of the heirloom jewelry they knew was kept there before fleeing with my $500,000. They were going for one final massive score. With Julian's authorization, I spent the next 24 hours turning the Sterling mansion into a reality show set. I worked with the head of security to install micro cameras in the eyes of oil paintings, inside flower arrangements, and tucked into the cornices of the high ceilings. Every corridor, every room, and specifically the library, was covered. We were ready to capture a felony in real time. Then, the universe threw a wrench into our perfectly calibrated machine. On Friday afternoon, as I was testing the audio feed in the kitchen, a black limousine pulled into the driveway. My blood ran cold as the chauffeur opened the door and Victoria Sterling stepped out. She was supposed to be at a spa retreat in Switzerland for another week, a trip Julian had arranged specifically to keep her away from the stress of the gala. She looked frail but sharp, her eyes scanning the grounds with a haunting familiarity. If she walked into the house and saw the Vances, she would not see new employees. She would see the faces of the people who had worked for her 3 decades ago, the people who were there the day her daughter vanished. She would scream. The Vances would bolt, and my chance to get a confession would evaporate. We were sitting on a powder keg, and the match had just arrived home early. The Vances entered the Sterling mansion with the wide-eyed gluttony of starving animals stumbling into a feast. From my vantage point in the garden shadows, I monitored their progress via the hidden feeds on my phone before moving to intercept them. They did not see a home. They saw a catalog of items to be stolen. I saw Mrs. Vance run her hand over a bronze statue, whispering to her husband that it would fetch $10,000 on the black market. They were vibrating with a toxic mixture of fear and avarice. Then, the variable we had feared walked into the frame. Victoria Sterling, my biological mother, crossed the main hall on her way to the library. Mr. Vance went pale. He grabbed his wife's arm, his knees buckling as he whispered that they needed to abort the mission immediately because she would recognize them. Mrs. Vance, however, was anchored by her greed. She hissed at him that the old woman was senile and would never remember the faces of two servants she had employed for 6 months over 30 years ago. Her arrogance was chilling, but it kept them in the trap. I circled around to the servants' entrance by the old equipment shed to meet them, clutching a leather suitcase heavy with stacks of cut newspaper. When they saw me, the facade of the loving parents evaporated instantly. Mr. Vance didn't even say hello. He just ripped the handle from my grip when I stumbled, feigning weakness. Mrs. Vance struck me across the face with the back of her hand. The force of it knocked me to the dirt, tasting copper. "You are pathetic," she spat, standing over me like a titan. "We should have just smothered you in your crib 33 years ago like we originally planned instead of keeping you as a pet. You have been nothing but a drain on us." I lay in the dirt, cheek throbbing, but internally I was screaming in triumph. The microphone taped to my chest had caught every syllable. In the security room, I knew Julian was listening. I imagined him gripping the desk, his knuckles white, realizing that the people he had just hired were the monsters who had haunted his family's nightmares for 3 decades. "Get in there and stay quiet until we come back," Mr. Vance growled. They shoved me into the darkness of the shed and slammed the door. I heard the heavy click of the padlock sliding home. They believed I was trapped. They believed they were free to march into the main house, sedate the family, and rob the safe with the $500,000 already in hand. They forgot one thing. They were the ones who had taught me how to survive captivity. I had spent half my childhood locked in closets and basements as punishment for perceived slights. I had learned to pick a lock with a stiff wire before I learned long division. I found a rusted nail on the floor and went to work on the old mechanism. It took me less than 45 seconds. The shackle popped open, and I slipped out into the cool night air. I did not run to safety. I ran toward the house. I checked my earpiece and heard Julian breathing heavily, preparing to send in the security team to intercept them in the hallway. "Do not engage, Julian," I whispered into my comms, sprinting across the lawn to the side entrance. "Wait until they open the safe." "If you stop them now, it is just trespassing and assault. We need burglary. We need grand larceny. We need to bury them so deep they never see the sun again." The gala was a symphony of excess, a swirling sea of black ties, designer gowns, and the clinking of champagne flutes. The air smelled of expensive perfume and anticipation. Downstairs, amidst the laughter of the city's elite, Julian stood like a statue near the grand staircase. To the guests, he was the attentive host, nodding at the right moments, but his eyes were glazed over. His entire consciousness was focused on the smartphone hidden in his palm, streaming the live feed from the library upstairs. I watched from the shadows of the mezzanine, no longer the battered woman in the dirt-stained clothes. I had shed that skin in the guest quarters. I was now dressed in a midnight blue gown that cost more than the Vances had earned in a decade. My hair was swept back, revealing the sterling jawline, and my posture was rigid with the cold certainty of retribution. On the screen, the Vances were moving like rats in a pantry. They had slipped away from their assigned posts, creeping down the mahogany hallway toward the master study. They were sweating, their eyes darting around with paranoid intensity. Mr. Vance approached the hidden panel behind the portrait of my great-grandfather. His hands shook as he punched in the code. Julian had deliberately left the combination unchanged from 33 years ago, a silent invitation to the trap. Click. The heavy steel door swung open. The Vances audibly gasped. Inside, resting on velvet cushions, were the sterling emeralds and diamonds, a collection worth millions. They did not hesitate. They began shoving necklaces and bracelets into their pockets, their greed overriding every survival instinct they possessed. "We are rich, Mary." Mr. Vance hissed, his voice trembling with euphoria. "We take this. We take the cash from the girl, and we disappear." "Put it back," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet drapes where I had been waiting. The transformation was absolute. The Vances spun around, dropping a diamond necklace onto the Persian rug. They squinted at me, confusion warring with recognition. They were looking for Elena, the broken, fearful daughter they had bullied for decades. Instead, they were facing a stranger who radiated power. "Who are you, Mrs.?" Vance stammered, backing up against the desk. "You really do not know." I stepped into the light, letting the chandelier illuminate my face. I stared directly at them, unblinking. "Look at me. Look closely. Do you not recognize these eyes? You stared into them every single day for 33 years. You stared into them while you starved me. You stared into them while you lied to me." "Elena, Mr." Vance whispered, the color draining from his face. "My name is Aurora Sterling," I declared, the syllables tasting like victory. "And I am home." Panic exploded in the room. Mrs. Vance, realizing the walls were closing in, reached into her apron and pulled out a paring knife she had stolen from the kitchen. She held it out with a shaking hand, her teeth bared in a snarl. "Stay back. I will kill you. I will kill you, just like I should have done when you were a crying brat." I did not flinch. I took another step forward, walking straight toward the blade. "I remember that night," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying calm. "I remember the smell of bleach on your hands. Mary, I remember the way the rain sounded against the metal roof of your old van. I remember you arguing about whether to toss me in the river because I had a fever and would not stop crying. Only the kidnappers would know those details. Only the monsters who stole a life would know the sound of my mother screaming as you drove away." The weight of the truth crushed Mr. Vance. His mind snapped. He realized there was no escape, no Mexico, no fortune. There was only the abyss. With a guttural roar of pure madness, he lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat to silence the witness who had risen from the dead. He never reached me. The double doors burst open with a crash that shook the walls. Julian stormed in, flanked by 4 armed security officers. He did not look like a CEO anymore. He looked like an executioner. He crossed the room in 2 strides and tackled Mr. Vance, driving him into the floor with the force of 33 years of suppressed grief. The transition from the velvet-draped luxury of the Sterling Library to the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the police precinct was jarring, but the Vances played their new role with terrifying commitment. When the police dragged them out of the mansion, pockets bulging with stolen emeralds and a briefcase full of shredded newspaper, they did not hang their heads in shame. They screamed. They wept. They threw themselves against the squad car windows, howling that they were innocent servants being framed by a mentally unstable daughter who hated them for being poor. In the interrogation room, their narrative was a masterclass in gaslighting. They claimed I had invited them there, that I had forced the jewelry on them as a gift, and that the robbery was a sick game I had invented to punish them for a strict upbringing. They used the last of their illicit savings to hire a sleazy defense attorney who specialized in media circuses. Within 24 hours, they had launched a countersuit against me for defamation and emotional distress. They took to social media, painting themselves as the victims of a cruel, elite conspiracy. Comments began to flood the internet, some sympathizing with the poor, elderly couple being crushed by the wealthy Sterling machine. I knew I could not let the court of public opinion be swayed by their lies. 2 days after the arrest, I called a press conference. I stood on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by Julian and my mother, facing a sea of cameras. I did not hide behind sunglasses. I looked directly into the lenses. "My name is not Elena Vance," I said, my voice steady and clear. "My name is Aurora Sterling. 33 years ago, I was stolen from my crib. The people you see crying on television are not my parents. They are my kidnappers." The silence that followed was absolute. Behind me, Julian projected the DNA results onto a massive screen, showing the 99.99% match. Then, we played the audio recording from the tool shed, the sound of Mrs. Vance's voice, sharp and cruel, echoed through the plaza. "We should have just smothered you in your crib 33 years ago like we originally planned." The sympathy for the Vances evaporated instantly, replaced by a collective shudder of horror. The final blow to their defense came not from me, but from their own past. Energized by the public outcry, the police executed a second, more thorough search warrant on the Vances' dilapidated home. Under the floorboards of the master bedroom, wrapped in plastic, they found a stack of ransom letters that had been written 33 years ago but never sent. The fear of the police dragnet back then had paralyzed them, causing them to keep the child instead of trading her. Forensic analysts matched the handwriting to Mr. Vance and found latent fingerprints preserved on the paper that matched both of them perfectly. Faced with irrefutable physical evidence, their lawyer resigned on the spot, refusing to be part of a losing battle. Left defenseless, the Vances did exactly what cowardly predators do when trapped. They turned on each other. The trial became a spectacle of mutual destruction. Mr. Vance took the stand, sweating and frantic, desperate to cut a deal. He pointed a shaking finger at his wife, claiming she was the mastermind, the one who had planned the abduction to pay off gambling debts. "I wanted to return the baby," he screamed, his eyes bulging. "I wanted to leave her at a church. It was Mary. She told me to drive away. She told me that if the baby did not stop crying, we should just stop feeding her until she went quiet forever." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The jurors looked at Mrs. Vance with expressions of sheer revulsion. She sat at the defense table, stone-faced, as her husband described how she had deliberately withheld milk from a terrifyingly small infant for 2 days, waiting for me to starve to death so they could dispose of the body, only relenting because he had feared a murder charge more than a kidnapping one. That revelation sealed their fate. They were not just thieves, they were monsters who had tortured a child for 3 decades. The gavel banged, calling for order. But the damage was done. The Vances had destroyed themselves. The reunion with my biological family was not the cinematic explosion of joy that movies promise. It was quieter, messier, and filled with a tentative, fragile hope. When the cameras stopped flashing and the police cars drove away, I sat in the drawing room of the Sterling estate with Victoria and Julian. My mother reached out to touch my face, her fingers trembling as they traced the jawline she had not seen since I was an infant. We wept, but there was also a profound sense of awkwardness between us. 33 years of silence is a vast canyon to bridge. I did not know how to be the daughter of a billionaire, and they did not know the woman who had clawed her way up from nothing. I made it clear that I could not simply erase the person I had become. I did not suddenly start wearing silk pajamas or spending my days at country clubs. I still woke up at 5 in the morning to make my own coffee, a habit formed from years of needing to leave the house before the Vances woke up to avoid their criticism. Julian tried to have the staff serve me, but he quickly learned to back off. They learned to love me not as the baby they lost, but as the survivor who returned. To honor that duality, I filed the legal paperwork to change my name. I did not discard the name Elena, for she was the one who had endured the fire. I became Aurora Elena Sterling. I also refused to be a trophy heiress. I returned to Omni Global, not as a mid-level analyst, but as the new director of information security. I used my intimate knowledge of how predators operate to overhaul our data systems, launching a new division dedicated to tracking digital footprints for missing children cases. It was my way of ensuring that no other child would have to wait 33 years to be found. However, the final chapter of my old life had to be written in a courtroom. The trial of Mr. and Mrs. Vance was the closing ceremony of my trauma. I stood on the witness stand, looking down at the two small, withered people in orange jumpsuits. They no longer looked like the giants who had dominated my childhood. They looked like what they were, parasites. The judge, a woman known for her icy demeanor and maximum sentencing, leaned forward as I gave my testimony. I did not scream or cry. I spoke with a clinical precision that seemed to unsettle the defense attorney more than tears would have. I described the psychological architecture of their abuse. I explained how they had not just stolen my body, but had tried to colonize my mind, planting seeds of guilt and debt from the moment I could speak. I told the court how they made me feel grateful for the bare minimum of survival, how they weaponized food and shelter to ensure I remained submissive. When the defense tried to argue for leniency, the Vances wept loudly. Mrs. Vance, in a display of breathtaking narcissism, wailed that they should be credited for not killing me, claiming that they had fed and clothed me for 3 decades. "We raised her," she screamed at the jury. "We gave her a home when we could have thrown her away." I leaned into the microphone, my voice cutting through her theatrics like a razor. "That was not child-rearing," I told her, and then I turned to the jury. "That was long-term hostage-keeping. You do not get credit for feeding a prisoner you kidnapped just to keep them alive for future use." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge looked visibly moved, her jaw tightening as she looked at the defendants. The deliberations took less than 2 hours. When the jury returned, the verdict was guilty on all counts: kidnapping, extortion, grand larceny, and aggravated child abuse. The judge did not hesitate. She sentenced both of them to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel banged down, echoing like a thunderclap, I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders. They would die in a cage, just as they had tried to make me live in one. Justice had not just been served, it had been delivered with an iron fist, as the bailiffs moved to shackle Mr. and Mrs. Vance. A final, desperate malice twisted Mr. Vance's face. He was not content to go to prison. He wanted to leave a crater behind him. He wrestled his arm free from the officer, his eyes locking onto Julian. "You think you won?" he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I still have one card left to play. The boy isn't a Sterling. I switched the blood samples at the clinic 30 years ago. Julian is not your son. Victoria, he is mine. He is the bastard son I had with my mistress." The courtroom erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet, shouting questions. My mother, overwhelmed by the sheer cruelty of the accusation, collapsed into Julian's arms. Julian stood frozen, his face draining of color as the implication hit him. If true, it would not only destroy his identity but throw the entire Sterling inheritance into legal chaos. It was a poison pill designed to rot our family from the inside out, even while Vance sat in a cell. I did not flinch. I had anticipated that a cornered rat would try to bite one last time. I walked calmly to the prosecutor's table and asked for the sealed manila envelope I had submitted into evidence but had not yet opened. The room quieted, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. I held the document up, facing the screaming man. "You are lying again," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the din. "I knew you were a pathological liar, so when I ran my own DNA test, I did not just test myself against my mother. I tested Julian against both of us. The results are right here." I ripped the seal open and pulled out the paper. "Julian Sterling is my full biological brother. We share 100% of the same parentage. He is a Sterling, through and through." "Mr." Vance froze, his mouth hanging open. But I was not finished. I wanted to crush him completely. "But there is one thing you do not know," I continued, stepping closer to the railing. "I dug into your past. Arthur, I found the mistress you are talking about, and I found the death certificate from 1992. Your son did not survive birth. I visited his grave in a pauper's cemetery in Houston. You do not have a secret heir. You have nothing. You are leaving this world with absolutely no legacy." The color left his face as if I had struck him physically. The realization that his final nuclear option had been a dud, and that his true secret was a tragedy he had tried to weaponize, broke him. He let out a guttural scream of despair, his knees buckling. It was not a scream of anger anymore. It was the sound of a man who realized he was truly, utterly defeated. The malice turned to humiliation as the crowd began to boo and jeer. The officers hoisted him up by his armpits and dragged him and his weeping wife toward the exit. I watched them go. The heavy metal door of the transport van slammed shut with a finality that echoed in my bones. They were gone. They were no longer my parents, my captors, or my burden. They were just inmates, number 459 and 460. I turned back to my family. Julian was holding our mother, who had regained consciousness, and they both looked at me with a mixture of awe and relief. We stood there as the flashbulbs popped, 3 Sterlings uniting against the storm, an unbreakable fortress that the Vances had failed to breach. I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding afternoon sun. The air tasted sweeter than it ever had before. I stopped by a municipal trash can near the curb. I looked down at my wrist, at the cheap, scratching plastic watch the Vances had forced me to wear for 10 years because they refused to buy me a new one. I unbuckled it. I did not feel sentimental. I felt light. I dropped it into the bin, watching it land among the refuse where it belonged. A sleek black car pulled up, and Julian opened the door for me. I stepped inside, leaving the dust of 33 years on the pavement behind me. I was Aurora Elena Sterling, and my life was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment down below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. If you enjoyed this journey of justice, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so this story can reach even more listeners.